Dr. Zifrian Krell looked at the list of students with disgust. His 4 blue arms moved quickly as he read each name. Most students were from advanced alien races. There were crystal beings who could think faster than computers. There were gas creatures who lived in space itself. There were robot minds that never made mistakes, but one name made him angry. Jake Martinez, human, from Earth. Another worthless human, Dr. Krell said to his helper, a young crystal being named Prism of Light. The Space Council forces us to take these primitive creatures. They only learned to travel between stars 50 years ago. They are like babies trying to learn advanced math. Prism of Light glowed softly. Should we make the classes easier for the human? Never. Dr. Krell clicked his mouthparts. Let him fail. Then everyone will see that humans do not belong here. The Galactic University of Centauri Prime was the best school in the galaxy. Only the smartest beings from every race could study there. The main building floated in space, its walls made of pure energy. Inside, the classrooms defied gravity and logic. Jake Martinez walked slowly through the hallway. Everything was so strange and beautiful. Walls shifted colors as he passed. The floor felt solid, but looked like flowing water. Other students floated by him without touching the ground. A tall, thin creature with green skin nodded at Jake. Its 3 eyes blinked in sequence. Jake tried to nod back, but felt awkward. He was the only human in sight. Jake found his classroom and stopped at the entrance. The room was a perfect sphere. Students sat on floating chairs, arranged in a circle, around a central platform. Some students glowed with inner light. Others were made of metal and circuits. A few looked like moving shadows with bright eyes. Dr. Krell stood on the central platform. He was 10 feet tall with smooth purple skin. His 4 arms moved independently as he prepared his lesson. When he saw Jake enter, his large black eyes narrowed. "Ah, the human arrives," Dr. Krell announced loudly. All the students turned to look at Jake. "Class, we have a special guest, a primitive from the edge of the galaxy." Jake felt his face turn red. He found an empty floating chair and sat down carefully. The chair adjusted to his body, but felt strange. All around him, other students whispered in languages that sounded like music, clicking or electronic beeps. The student next to Jake was made entirely of silver metal. Glowing symbols moved across its face like a computer screen. "I am Unit 47. It said in a flat voice. "You are the biological organism from the primitive planet." "I'm Jake," he replied quietly. "And Earth isn't that primitive." Unit 47's symbols flashed rapidly. "Your species achieved faster than light travel 47.3 years ago. My creators mastered this technology 847,000 years ago. The mathematical difference indicates extreme primitiveness." Before Jake could respond, Dr. Krell began his lecture. "Today, we study multi-dimensional physics. This subject requires understanding of 17 different types of reality. Most species need centuries of evolution to grasp basic concepts." Dr. Krell waved his arms, and equations appeared in the air around him. The symbols were unlike anything Jake had ever seen. They moved and changed shape, folding into themselves and expanding into complex patterns. "Reality," Dr. Krell continued, "is not what primitive minds believe. Space and time are illusions. Matter is simply concentrated thought. Energy is the dream of sleeping gods." Jake pulled out a notebook and pen. The other students stared at these ancient tools with confusion. Most of them had no physical bodies to hold writing instruments. They absorbed information directly into their minds. "Mr. Martinez," Dr. Krell said suddenly, "perhaps you can explain to us how your species understands the nature of reality." Jake felt every eye in the room focus on him. His mouth went dry. "Well, On Earth, we think reality is made of atoms and energy. We believe in gravity and the laws of physics. Several students made sounds that Jake realized were laughter. A gas creature in the corner released colorful clouds that his translator said meant amusing ignorance. Dr. Krell smiled, showing rows of sharp teeth. How charmingly simple. You see, class, this is what happens when evolution stops too early. The human thinks reality follows rules. He cannot understand that reality is whatever consciousness decides it should be. The professor turned back to Jake. Tell me, Primitive, what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object? Jake thought carefully. This was an old Earth puzzle. Well, the question itself is flawed. If something is truly unstoppable, then nothing can be truly immovable. And if something is truly immovable, then nothing can be truly unstoppable. Dr. Krell's eyes widened slightly. He had not expected that answer, but he recovered quickly. Typical linear thinking. Your mind can only process simple either-or logic. You cannot grasp that both conditions can exist simultaneously in different dimensional phases. The lesson continued for 3 hours. Dr. Krell explained concepts that made Jake's head hurt. He talked about consciousness creating matter, time, flowing backward, and space folding inside itself. The other students absorbed everything easily, their advanced minds processing information at incredible speeds. Jake struggled to keep up. He wrote notes frantically, trying to understand ideas that seemed impossible. How could time flow backward? How could something exist and not exist at the same time? How could consciousness create physical objects? When class ended, the other students floated away without speaking to Jake. He gathered his primitive notebook and pen, feeling very alone and very stupid. Mr. Martinez, Dr. Krell called out as Jake reached the door. I suggest you reconsider your enrollment here. This university is for advanced minds, not primitive thought patterns. Jake turned around. I'll work harder, Professor. I can learn. This, Dr. Krell laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Your species has been trying to understand advanced physics for centuries. What makes you think you can succeed where your entire civilization has failed? Jake did not have an answer. He left the classroom feeling smaller than ever before. In the hallway, he passed more alien students who looked at him with curiosity or pity. Some whispered about the pet human who thought he could learn real science. That night, Jake sat in his small dormitory room, staring at his notes. The symbols and equations looked like meaningless scribbles. He had dreamed of studying at the greatest university in the galaxy. Now he wondered if Dr. Krell was right. Maybe humans really were too primitive to understand advanced science. But something inside Jake refused to give up. He had worked too hard to get here. He had scored higher than anyone else on Earth's entrance exams. He had learned 6 alien languages and studied advanced mathematics for years. Jake opened his notebook to a fresh page and began reviewing the day's lesson. If it took him 10 times longer than the other students, so be it. He would prove that. Humans belonged here, even if it killed him. Outside his window, the stars of Centauri Prime glowed like distant promises. Somewhere among them was Earth, his home, counting on him to succeed. Jake would not let them down, no matter what Dr. Krell or anyone else thought about human intelligence. 3 weeks passed like a nightmare for Jake Martinez. Every day brought new humiliation in Dr. Krell's classroom. The professor had made Jake his favorite target, asking him impossible questions, and then tearing apart his answers in front of everyone. Mr. Martinez, Dr. Krell would say with his cruel smile, please enlighten us with human wisdom. Then he would ask about concepts that hurt Jake's brain just to think about. The other students had learned to enjoy the show. When Jake struggled to answer, they would flash their lights, release colored gases, or make electronic sounds that meant laughter. Jake had become their entertainment, not their classmate. Today was worse than usual. Dr. Krell was teaching about time travel and parallel universes. He stood on his floating platform, his 4 arms moving in complex patterns as he spoke. Time, he explained, is not a river flowing in one direction. It is an ocean with currents moving in all directions at once. Advanced minds can swim through this ocean freely. Jake tried to follow along, but the concepts were beyond anything he had learned on Earth. The other students absorbed the information easily. Crystal beings shifted their inner light to show understanding. Robot minds processed data at superhuman speeds. Gas creatures swirled in patterns that indicated deep thought. Now, Dr. Krell said, his black eyes finding Jake instantly. Let use hear from our primitive friend. Mr. Martinez, how would your species handle the grandfather paradox? Jake's heart sank. He knew this question was coming. Dr. Krell always saved the hardest questions for him. The grandfather paradox asks, what happens if you travel back in time and prevent your grandfather from meeting your grandmother? If they never meet, you're never born. But if you're never born, you can't travel back in time to stop them from meeting. And how do humans solve this puzzle? Dr. Krell asked, his voice dripping with fake interest. Jake remembered his Earth physics classes. Some scientists think the universe would split into parallel timelines. Others believe in the Novikov self-consistency principle, where events would conspire to prevent paradoxes. The classroom erupted in alien laughter. Unit 47, the robot student next to Jake, made a sound like static electricity. Parallel timelines? Consistency principles? How primitive. Dr. Krell raised one of his 4 hands for silence. You see, class, how limited biological thinking truly is. The human believes time has rules. He cannot comprehend that time is simply another dimension to be folded and manipulated at will. The professor began drawing equations in the air. They twisted and turned like living things, folding through dimensions that Jake could not see. A truly advanced mind simply steps outside of time altogether. The grandfather paradox does not exist because the concept of before and after becomes meaningless. Jake felt stupid and small. Around him, alien students nodded their various heads in understanding. How could they grasp concepts that seemed impossible to him? Perhaps, Dr. Krell continued, our human pet can explain how. His species would achieve consciousness transfer across dimensional barriers? Jake had no idea what that even meant. We don't have that technology on Earth. Of course you don't, Dr. Krell laughed. Your minds are trapped in your biological brains. You cannot imagine consciousness as pure information, free to move between bodies and dimensions. Nexus 7, a tall robot student with glowing blue eyes, spoke up. Professor, surely the human should not be in advanced classes. Its primitive neural patterns will contaminate our learning environment. An excellent point, Dr. Krell agreed. But the Galactic Council requires us to give these creatures a chance. Consider it a fascinating study in evolutionary failure. Jake wanted to stand up and leave, but something kept him in his seat. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the thought of all the humans back on Earth who were counting on him. He would not give up, no matter how much it hurt. The worst came during group project assignments. Dr. Krell announced that students would work in pairs to solve a complex problem about moving consciousness between bodies. Jake waited as the professor. Assigned partners. Mr. Martinez, Dr. Krell said with obvious pleasure, you will work with Nexus 7. The robot student's blue eyes flashed angrily. Professor, this is unfair. My computational abilities should not be handicapped by working with a biological primitive. The assignment stands, Dr. Krell replied. Perhaps you can teach the humans something about real intelligence. After class, Jake approached Nexus 7 carefully. The robot was 8 feet tall and made of polished silver metal. Its face was a screen, displaying complex mathematical symbols. "Listen," Jake said. "I know you don't want to work with me, but we're stuck together, so let's try to make the best of it." Nexus 7's screen flickered with what Jake had learned were signs of disgust. "Your brain operates at 0.3% of my processing speed. Working with you will reduce my efficiency to unacceptable levels. Maybe we can divide the work," Jake suggested. "You handle the calculations, and I'll work on the theoretical framework." "You work on theory?" Nexus 7's voice became even more electronic and cold. "Your species still believes consciousness is produced by brain chemistry. You understand nothing about the true nature of mind and reality." Jake spent the next week trying to research their project. He visited the university's vast library, a place where information existed as floating holograms and interactive light patterns. While other students absorbed knowledge directly into their minds, Jake had to read slowly through primitive text displays. The project was about transferring consciousness from one body to another. Most alien species had mastered this technology centuries ago. They could move their minds between different bodies like humans changed clothes. Some races even kept backup copies of their consciousness in case their bodies died. Jake struggled to understand the basic concepts. How could consciousness exist separately from the brain? How could thoughts and memories be copied and transferred? Earth science had no answers for these questions. Every time Jake met with Nexus 7, the robot reminded him of his inadequacy. "Your neural patterns are too simple," it would say. "You cannot process information in 11-dimensional matrices. Your biological limitations make this partnership impossible." Other students began avoiding Jake entirely. When he sat down in the cafeteria, conversations would stop. Aliens would move to different tables, leaving Jake to eat alone. He felt like a disease that might spread to healthy minds. The breaking point came during a study session in the library. Jake was struggling with a holographic textbook that kept changing languages faster than he could read. Nexus 7 processed the same information in seconds. "This is hopeless," Nexus 7 announced loudly enough for other students to hear. "The human cannot even read at an acceptable speed. How can it contribute to advanced research?" Several alien students gathered around to watch Jake's humiliation. A gas creature named Whisper Cloud released pheromones that meant amusement. A crystal being called Sharp Light flashed patterns that indicated mockery. "Maybe," Sharp Light suggested, "the human should audit basic mathematics before attempting university-level work." "Basic mathematics?" Whisper Cloud swirled with laughter. "I doubt it can handle simple arithmetic without mechanical aids." Jake felt his face burning with shame. He was surrounded by beings whose intelligence made him feel like an insect. Everything they said was true. He was primitive, slow, and out of place. "You know what?" Jake said quietly, standing up from his study table. "You're all right. I don't belong here." He gathered his primitive notebook and pen while the alien students watched in satisfaction. As he walked away, he heard Nexus 7 speaking to the others. "Finally, the biological realizes its limitations. Perhaps now we can return to serious academic work." Jake made it halfway to his dormitory before the anger hit him. These creatures thought they were so smart, so advanced, but they had never struggled for anything. They had been born with incredible intelligence and advanced technology. They had never had to work for knowledge or fight for respect. Humans were different. They had to earn everything through hard work and determination. Maybe that was actually a strength, not a weakness. Jake turned around and walked back to the library. He would not quit. He would not let these arrogant aliens win. Somehow, he would find a way to prove that human intelligence was valuable, even if it was different from theirs. The library was nearly empty now. Most students absorbed information so quickly that they rarely needed to study for long periods. Jake found a quiet corner where holographic books floated, like glowing butterflies. He began researching everything he could find about consciousness and reality. If he could not think as fast as the aliens, he would think differently. If he could not process information like a computer, he would use human intuition and creativity. Somewhere in all this advanced knowledge, there had to be something the aliens were missing. Something that only a primitive human mind could see. Jake spent every night in the library now. While other students slept or recharged their power cells, he read through ancient texts that most aliens ignored. The library's forgotten section contained knowledge from races that had vanished long ago. Most of these old books were written by species that were considered primitive by modern standards. The advanced alien students saw no point in studying outdated theories from extinct civilizations. But Jake was desperate enough to look anywhere for answers. On his fourth sleepless night, Jake discovered something interesting. Hidden in a dusty corner of the digital archives was a collection of papers by a race called the Ethereals. According to the records, they had disappeared over 1 million years ago. The Ethereals had been famous throughout the galaxy for their incredible mathematical abilities. They could solve problems that baffled even the most advanced computer minds. But their methods were strange and hard to understand. Jake opened the first ethereal text and began reading. The writing was simple and clear, unlike the complex theories of modern alien science. The Ethereals believed that mathematics was not about calculations, but about seeing patterns. True understanding, one ethereal philosopher had written, comes not from processing information, but from recognizing the connections that bind all things together. The universe speaks in patterns, not numbers. This idea fascinated Jake. On Earth, humans often talked about having gut feelings or intuition about problems. Maybe the Ethereals had discovered something similar. Jake read deeper into the ethereal texts. They described something called intuitive mathematics, a way of solving problems by recognizing patterns instead of making calculations. According to the Ethereals, this method could find solutions that pure logic missed. The mind that thinks. Too precisely, another text explained, cannot see the forest for the trees. Sometimes the simple answer is hidden behind complex thinking. Jake felt a spark of excitement. This was exactly what he needed. While his alien classmates used their advanced minds to process enormous amounts of data, maybe he could use human intuition to see patterns they missed. He began studying the ethereal methods carefully. They used strange diagrams that looked more like art than mathematics. Instead of calculating exact numbers, they focused on relationships and connections between ideas. Jake tried applying these techniques to his homework problems. At first, nothing happened. The ethereal methods seemed as impossible as everything else in the advanced curriculum. But slowly, Jake began to see things differently. Instead of trying to understand every detail of multidimensional physics, he started looking for simple patterns that connected different concepts. Instead of memorizing complex equations, he focused on the basic relationships they described. Something clicked in his mind. The advanced theories that Dr. Krell taught were incredibly complex, but underneath all the complexity were simple patterns that repeated themselves throughout the universe. Jake began working on his consciousness transfer project with new energy. Instead of trying to map every thought and memory, like Nexus 7 suggested, Jake wondered if consciousness might follow simple patterns that could be recognized and copied. He found references in the ethereal texts to something called emotional resonance patterns. According to this theory, consciousness was not just thoughts and memories, but also the emotional connections between them. Maybe consciousness could be transferred by copying these emotional patterns instead of trying to duplicate every neural pathway. Jake worked through the mathematics using ethereal techniques. The calculations were much simpler than conventional methods, but they produced the same results. In fact, his approach required far less energy and processing power than the methods used by advanced alien civilizations. When Jake showed his work to Nexus 7, the robot's screen flickered with confusion. "This cannot be correct," Nexus 7 said, running the calculations through its processors. "Your method is too simple. Consciousness transfer requires mapping 47 trillion neural connections simultaneously." "Maybe it doesn't," Jake replied. "Maybe consciousness is simpler than you think." Nexus 7 spent hours checking Jake's mathematics. The robot ran every test it could think of, looking for errors in the human's work. But the equations held up under every examination. "I do not understand," Nexus 7 finally admitted. "Your approach violates established principles of consciousness science. It should not work, yet the mathematics are correct." Jake smiled for the first time in weeks. Maybe established principles are wrong. Maybe consciousness isn't as complicated as everyone thinks. "But how did you derive this solution?" Nexus 7 asked. "My processors cannot find the logical steps that led to your conclusion." "I stopped trying to think like a computer," Jake explained. "I started thinking like a human." Jake continued studying the ethereal texts every night. He learned about pattern recognition techniques that had been forgotten for millions of years. The ethereals had discovered that the universe contained repeating patterns at every level, from the smallest particles to the largest galaxies. These patterns could be recognized by minds that knew how to look for them. But the recognition required intuition, not calculation. It required the ability to see connections that logic could not prove. Jake began to understand why the ethereals had vanished. As their civilization became more advanced, they had probably abandoned these intuitive methods in favor of more sophisticated technologies. Eventually, they had lost the ability to see the simple patterns that had made them great. The same thing was happening to modern alien civilizations. They had become so focused on complex calculations that they could not see simple solutions. Their advanced minds had become limitations instead of advantages. Jake realized that humans might have an advantage, precisely because they were considered primitive. Human minds were not cluttered with overly complex thinking patterns. They could still recognize intuitive connections that more advanced minds missed. This discovery gave Jake new confidence in his project work, while Nexus 7 continued to process enormous amounts of data about consciousness transfer. Jake focused on finding the simple patterns that connected different aspects of consciousness. He discovered that emotional memories followed predictable patterns throughout all known species. Love, fear, joy, and sadness created similar neural resonances, whether the being was human, alien, or artificial. These emotional patterns might be the key to transferring consciousness between different types of bodies. Jake's solution was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of copying every thought and memory, his method would identify the emotional resonance patterns that defined a consciousness. These patterns could then be recreated in a new body, bringing the consciousness along with them. The energy requirements were minimal compared to conventional methods. Jake's approach could transfer consciousness using less than 1% of the power needed by current alien technology. Nexus 7 was amazed when Jake explained the complete theory. "This is impossible," the robot said. "You have solved a problem that has challenged our greatest minds for centuries. And you did it using methods that should not work." "Maybe that's the point," Jake replied. "Maybe the greatest minds are thinking too hard to see the simple answer." As Jake prepared for his project presentation, he felt nervous but excited. He had found something that the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy had missed. A simple solution hidden behind complex thinking. Jake knew that Dr. Krell and the other students would be skeptical. They would not want to believe that a primitive human had discovered something they had missed. But the mathematics were solid, and the theory was sound. For the first time since arriving at the university, Jake felt like he belonged there. He had proven to himself that human intelligence was valuable, even if it was different from alien intelligence. The night before his presentation, Jake stood at his dormitory window, looking out at the stars. Somewhere among them was Earth, his home planet full of billions of humans who were considered primitive by galactic standards. But maybe being primitive was not a weakness. Maybe it was exactly what the galaxy needed. Maybe human minds could see things that more advanced minds could not. Jake had stumbled onto something bigger than just a better method for consciousness transfer. He had discovered that intelligence was not just about processing power or computational speed. Sometimes the simplest minds could find the most elegant solutions. Tomorrow, he would show the galaxy what human thinking could accomplish. He would prove that primitiveness could be a strength, not a weakness. And maybe, just maybe, he would change how the entire universe thought about intelligence itself. The day of project presentations had arrived. Jake sat in the spherical classroom, his hands shaking slightly as he watched other students present their work. The floating chairs arranged around Dr. Krell's central platform were filled with the galaxy's most advanced minds, all eager to show off their superior intelligence. Dr. Krell floated above them all, his 4 purple arms crossed in satisfaction. He had been looking forward to this day for weeks. Finally, he would have the perfect opportunity to demonstrate human intellectual inferiority in front of the entire class. The first group to present was a team of crystal beings from the Vortex system. They created a light show that made Jake's eyes water, manipulating photons directly with their minds to display complex equations. Their consciousness transfer method involved converting thoughts into pure energy and then reconstructing them in crystalline matrices. Elegant work, Dr. Krell praised them. Your approach demonstrates the superiority of silicon-based intelligence over primitive biological thinking. Next came a team of gas creatures from the Nephilim Nebula. They created temporary pocket dimensions to demonstrate their theory, folding space itself to show how consciousness could be moved between different realities. Their method required the manipulation of 11 different dimensional phases simultaneously. Excellent, Dr. Krell announced. This is what true advanced thinking can accomplish. Group after group presented increasingly complex solutions. Robot minds displayed calculations that filled the entire classroom with floating numbers. Energy beings showed how consciousness could be transmitted faster than light across galactic distances. Each presentation was more sophisticated than the last. Jake felt his confidence shrinking with every demonstration. These solutions were so advanced, so elegant, so far beyond anything humans could understand. How could his simple theory compete with minds that could manipulate reality itself? Finally, Dr. Krell called Jake and Nexus 7 to present. The professor's black eyes gleamed with anticipation. This would be the highlight of his day, watching the primitive human embarrass himself in front of everyone. Ah, our human-machine collaboration, Dr. Krell announced with obvious pleasure. I am particularly curious to see how biological limitations have affected even our most advanced artificial intelligence. Jake walked slowly to the central platform, carrying his old-fashioned notebook. Around him, alien students prepared to enjoy the show. Some were already making sounds that indicated amusement. Others flashed lights or released pheromones that meant anticipation. Nexus 7 followed behind Jake, its metal body moving with perfect mechanical precision. The robot screen displayed symbols that Jake had learned meant embarrassment and frustration. Before we begin, Dr. Krell said loudly, I should mention that this project represents a fascinating study in intellectual incompatibility. Can advanced artificial intelligence overcome the handicap of working with primitive biological patterns? The classroom erupted in alien laughter. Jake felt his face turn red, but he forced himself to stand straight. He had worked too hard to give up. No. Go ahead, Mr. Martinez, Dr. Krell said with fake kindness. Enlighten us with human wisdom. Jake began his presentation quietly, explaining how he had researched the ancient ethereal texts. Several students immediately made sounds of derision. The ethereals were considered historical curiosities, their primitive methods long since abandoned by more sophisticated civilizations. The ethereals? Interrupted Sharp Light, the crystal being who had mocked Jake before. You are basing your research on extinct primitives? How appropriate for a human. More laughter filled the classroom. Dr. Krell raised one hand for silence. But his expression showed that he was enjoying every moment of Jake's humiliation. Jake continued, despite the interruptions. He explained his theory about emotional resonance patterns and consciousness, transfer through pattern recognition instead of data mapping. As he spoke, the laughter gradually died away. Jake's solution was not flashy like the other presentations. There were no light shows or dimensional manipulations. Just simple diagrams and elegant mathematics that anyone could understand. But as Jake continued explaining, something strange happened. The alien students began paying closer attention. His theory was not just mathematically sound, it was surprisingly clever in its simplicity. Nexus 7 stepped forward to present the experimental data. The robot screen displayed test results that made the entire classroom fall silent. Jake's method had successfully transferred consciousness with 99.7% accuracy while using only 0.3% of the energy required by conventional techniques. Run those numbers again, demanded Whisper Cloud, a gas creature who had mocked Jake weeks earlier. There must be an error. Nexus 7 ran the calculations again. The results were identical. Jake's simple method outperformed every advanced technique, and the galaxy. Dr. Krell's forearms began trembling. He stared at the data displays with growing disbelief. This cannot be correct, he stammered. Consciousness transfer requires enormous computational power. Your method is too simple. Maybe simple is better, Jake said quietly. Maybe we've been making consciousness transfer harder than it needs to be. The implications of Jake's discovery began sinking in throughout the classroom. If consciousness could be transferred using emotional patterns instead of complete neural mapping, it would revolutionize not just medicine, but space travel, communication, and dozens of other technologies. Sharplight's crystal body flickered rapidly as it processed the possibilities. Your method could reduce consciousness backup costs by 99%. Colonial expeditions could transfer consciousness across galactic distances using minimal energy. Unit 47, the robot student who had dismissed Jake as primitive, spoke in a voice filled with electronic confusion. But this violates everything we know about consciousness science. How can emotional patterns contain enough information to recreate a complete mind? Jake smiled. Because consciousness isn't just information. It's the connections between information, the patterns that tie thoughts and memories together. If you copy the patterns, the details fill themselves in. Dr. Krell struggled to find flaws in Jake's reasoning. He had built his entire career on the assumption that consciousness was impossibly complex, requiring the most advanced technology to understand and manipulate. Jake's simple solution threatened everything he believed about intelligence and civilization. Your approach is unorthodox, Dr. Krell said carefully. It lacks the sophistication we expect from advanced research. Maybe sophistication is the problem, Jake replied. Maybe we've been so focused on making things complex that we missed the simple solution. Nexus 7 displayed additional test results showing Jake's method working with different alien species. Crystal beings, gas creatures, energy forms, and artificial intelligences could all be successfully transferred using emotional resonance patterns. The human's theory appears to be universally applicable, Nexus 7 announced. It works with every type of consciousness we have tested. The classroom erupted in chaos as students realized what this meant. Jake Martinez, the primitive human they had mocked and dismissed, had just revolutionized galactic science. His supposedly inferior mind had solved a problem that had challenged the galaxy's greatest thinkers for millennia. Dr. Krell sat down heavily in his floating chair, his four arms hanging limply at his sides. His worldview was crumbling around him. Everything he had taught about intelligence, consciousness, and civilization was being challenged by a species he considered barely above animals. How? He whispered. How did you see what we could not? Jake looked around the classroom at all the alien students who had mocked him. They were staring at him now with expressions of amazement, confusion, and grudging respect. Maybe because I think differently, Jake said. Maybe because humans aren't advanced enough to overthink simple problems. The silence in the classroom was deafening. For the first time in his career, Dr. Krell had nothing to say. The primitive human had just taught the teacher, and everyone in the room knew it. Jake gathered his notebook and prepared to leave the platform. As he walked past Dr. Krell, the professor grabbed his arm with one of his four hands. Wait, Dr. Krell said quietly. I need to understand. How did your primitive mind accomplish what our greatest thinkers could not? Jake looked into the professor's large black eyes and saw something he had never seen before. Genuine curiosity instead of arrogant dismissal. Maybe that's the answer right there, Jake said gently. You keep calling human minds primitive. But maybe primitive minds can see things that advanced minds miss. As Jake left the classroom, he could hear excited conversations breaking out behind him. The galaxy's most advanced students were discussing his work, trying to understand how a supposedly inferior species had made such a breakthrough. Jake smiled as he walked down the hallway. For the first time since arriving at the university, he felt like he truly belonged there. 3 months after Jake's presentation, the Galactic University was a completely different place. News of the humans' breakthrough had spread throughout the academic community faster than light-speed communications could carry it. Scientists from every corner of the galaxy wanted to understand how a primitive species had revolutionized consciousness science. Jake found himself at the center of a scientific revolution he had never intended to start. His paper on intuitive pattern recognition in multidimensional physics was being translated into over 3,000 languages. Universities across the galaxy were requesting copies of the ancient ethereal texts that Jake had discovered. But the most dramatic change was in Dr. Krell himself. The proud professor who had once mocked human intelligence now sat in the front row of Jake's special seminars, taking notes with the eager attention of a first-year student. His 4 purple arms moved quickly as he tried to understand concepts that challenged everything he thought he knew about intelligence. Mr. Martinez, Dr. Krell said after one particularly challenging lecture on consciousness patterns, I must ask you something that troubles me greatly. Jake looked at his former tormentor with patience. The arrogant alien who had once called humans primitive was gone, replaced by a confused academic struggling to understand new ideas. What is it, Professor? How did you know to look in the right direction? My species has been studying consciousness for over 50,000 years. We have the most advanced computational minds in the galaxy. Yet you found a solution that we missed completely. Jake thought carefully before answering. Around them, other students listened with quiet attention. These same aliens who had once laughed at Jake's questions now hung on his every word. I think it's because humans are used to being underestimated, Jake said finally. We've learned to find strength in our weaknesses. When everyone tells you that you're not smart enough, you start looking for different ways to be smart. Dr. Krell's large black eyes blinked slowly. You are saying that intellectual disadvantage became an advantage? In a way, yes. Your minds are so advanced that you can process incredible amounts of information. But sometimes too much information makes problems seem more complex than they really are. Jake gestured to the holographic equations floating around them. Look at these consciousness transfer formulas that alien scientists developed. They're incredibly sophisticated, but they're also incredibly complicated. Sometimes the simple answer gets buried under all that complexity. Sharplight, the crystal being who had once mocked Jake, flickered with understanding. You are suggesting that our cognitive superiority became a limitation? Not a limitation, Jake replied. Just a different way of thinking. Your minds are like incredibly powerful computers. You can process enormous amounts of data and perform complex calculations. But human minds are more like pattern recognition systems. We're good at seeing connections that logic can't prove. Nexus 7 raised one of its metal arms. The robot that had once dismissed Jake as a biological primitive now worked as his research assistant. Can you provide an example of this pattern recognition phenomenon? Jake smiled. Sure. On Earth, we have a game called chess. Human chess masters can often beat computer programs not because they calculate more moves, but because they recognize patterns that tell them which moves feel right. They use intuition that they can't fully explain. Dr. Krell leaned forward in his floating chair. And you applied this intuitive pattern recognition to consciousness science. Exactly. Instead of trying to map every neural pathway and quantum state, I looked for the emotional patterns that connect thoughts and memories. The ethereal texts taught me that consciousness might be more about relationships than raw data. The implications of Jake's approach were still reverberating throughout galactic civilization. His consciousness transfer method was being implemented in hospitals, space exploration programs, and research facilities across thousands of worlds. The energy savings alone would transform galactic economics, but Jake's impact went beyond just one scientific breakthrough. His success had forced the galaxy to reconsider fundamental assumptions about intelligence, evolution, and civilization itself. Mr. Martinez, Whisper Cloud asked, releasing pheromones that indicated deep thought. Do you believe other primitive species might possess similar hidden advantages? Jake considered the question carefully. I think every species probably has unique strengths that others might overlook. The problem is that everyone assumes technological advancement equals intelligence. But maybe there are different types of intelligence that we haven't recognized yet. This idea had sparked a galaxy-wide search for overlooked civilizations and forgotten knowledge. Scientists were revisiting ancient texts from extinct species, looking for insights that modern thinking might have missed. Several breakthrough discoveries had already emerged from this research. Dr. Krell had become one of Jake's most dedicated followers in this new approach to science. The professor who had once represented everything arrogant about advanced alien thinking was now pioneering a field called primitive wisdom studies. I must admit something to you, Mr. Martinez, Dr. Krell said after the seminar ended and other students had left. When you first arrived, I saw you as proof of human intellectual inferiority. I used you as an example to demonstrate the superiority of advanced minds. Jake nodded. I know. It hurt at the time, but I think it actually helped me in the long run. Dr. Krell's forearms gestured in confusion. How could my cruelty have helped you? Because it forced me to think differently. If you had been kind and supportive, I might have tried to learn the same way as everyone else. But since your methods didn't work for me, I had to find my own path. This insight had become central to Jake's new teaching philosophy. Instead of trying to force all students to think in the same advanced patterns, he encouraged each species to use their natural cognitive strengths. You know what's funny? Jake continued. You were trying to prove that humans were inferior, but you actually helped me discover that we might have unique advantages. Dr. Krell was quiet for a long moment. I have been thinking about this paradox. In attempting to demonstrate your species' intellectual limitations, I inadvertently created the conditions for your greatest breakthrough. Maybe that's how real learning works, Jake suggested. Maybe we learn the most when we're challenged to think in new ways. 6 months later, Jake Martinez became the youngest professor in Galactic University history. His appointment caused controversy among traditional academics, but the results spoke for themselves. His classes were always full, and his students came from every corner of the galaxy. Jake's teaching style was unlike anything the university had ever seen. Instead of lecturing from a position of superior knowledge, he encouraged students to explore their own unique ways of understanding complex problems. Crystal beings learned to use their light-based thinking in new ways. Gas creatures discovered applications for their dimensional perception abilities. Even artificial intelligences found that their computational power could be enhanced by pattern recognition techniques. Dr. Krell became Jake's closest colleague and co-author. Together, they published a groundbreaking paper titled The Paradox of Primitive Wisdom: Why Simple Minds Solve Complex Problems. The paper argued that intellectual diversity was essential for scientific progress, and that every species had valuable contributions to make regardless of their technological level. Intelligence, they wrote, is not a ladder with primitive species at the bottom and advanced civilizations at the top. It is a vast ecosystem where different types of thinking contribute to the whole. The final validation of Jake's approach came when the Galactic Council officially changed its educational policies. Universities throughout the galaxy were now required to include cognitive diversity programs that encourage different approaches to learning and problem solving. Jake stood in his new classroom, looking out at a diverse group of students from dozens of different species. In the front row sat a young human exchange student from Earth, nervous and excited to be studying alongside alien minds. "What's your name?" Jake asked the human student gently. "Lisa Chun," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake smiled, remembering his own fear and excitement when he had first arrived. "Don't worry, Lisa. Being different isn't a weakness here. It's exactly what makes you valuable." As Jake began his first lecture as a professor, he reflected on how much had changed. He had arrived at the university as a primitive human expected to fail. Now he was helping to reshape how the entire galaxy thought about intelligence and learning. "Today, we're going to study consciousness and reality," Jake announced to his class. "But before we begin, I want you to remember something important. The universe is full of patterns waiting to be discovered. Sometimes the most elegant solutions come from the most unexpected places." In the back of the classroom, Dr. Krell sat with his notebook, ready to learn from the human who had taught him that wisdom could come from any source, no matter how primitive it might seem. Jake looked out at his diverse class of students and smiled. Each mind in the room was unique and valuable. Each species brought different strengths and perspectives. Together, they would push the boundaries of knowledge further than any single civilization.